I'm going to talk about corpus stylistics, which is something that I've been working on for quite some time, and recently started to think, well, what am I doing when I'm doing corpus stylistics? What makes it different from corpus linguistics? So that's really the topic of my talk. I haven't been to this conference for quite some time, but I was at the first one in Lancaster in 2001, which coincided pretty much with the point at which I became interested in corpus linguistics, mainly because Tony McHenry was paying me to do it. And I was working on a project with Tony and Eleanor Semino and Mick Short, where we were looking at speech writing and thought presentation in spoken English. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that area later on. So yes, I was at the first Corpus Linguistics Conference, so it's a huge honour to have been asked to do this talk, and I'm very grateful to Paul and to Michaela and the rest of the organising team for inviting me. Before I start, I just want to correct a horrible error in my abstract. I was reading this last night to remind myself of what I said I would talk about. And I'd said, in stylistics, corpus methods are increasingly being adopted, not because of the influential work of corpus linguists such as Stubbs and Marburg. There should be a least there. I thought I've inadvertently given the idea that this is going to be a hugely controversial talk, and it really isn't. Okay, right, so moving on. So what's the role of corpora in stylistics? Well, I think this quotation from Henry Widdowson nicely sums up the value of corpora. So Widdowson says, stylistics claims to provide linguistic substantiation for the interpretation of literary texts. Since corpus analysis is par excellence a means of revealing textual features in precise detail, it seems reasonable to suppose that it must be relevant to the stylistic enterprise. And I think most stylisticians now would agree with that. I think Widdowson connects stylistics with the analysis of literary texts. I think it goes a bit beyond that, and I prefer to see stylistics as the analysis of style in texts of all types, and I'll talk more about that later on. But just out of interest, I had a look in Language and Literature, which is the primary stylistics journal, just for references to corpus in articles that were published in the journal. And I think you can see that over the years there's been a sort of upward trend in articles that refer to corpus, to the word corpus and corpus linguistics. Now, not all of these articles are doing corpus linguistics, but I think it's interesting that the references are increasing. I then looked at references to corpus stylistics specifically. And again, I think there's a sort of upward trend there, which I think is gratifying. There's a gap in 2003 and 2004 for some reason. But in 2003, I went to the Parla conference in Istanbul. Parla is the Poetics and Linguistics Association, the primary conference for stylistics. And it was shortly after I'd started working on this project with Tony and Mick Short and Eleanor Semino. And at the conference, I took part in a panel discussion that was organised by Martin Wynne. And there was me and Martin and John Sinclair and Peter Stockwell, who, if you don't know Peter from his work in cognitive stylistics, you may know his work with Michaela more recently on corpus stylistics. And Martin had asked us each to talk about the value of corpora to stylistics, the value as we saw it. And I'd been working on this project doing manual annotation of speech writing and thought presentation. So my argument was that manual annotation is valuable to stylistics. Not surprisingly, John Sinclair was arguing that I was wrong, and Peter Stockwell was arguing that we were both wrong. And it was Peter's position that I found most interesting, because Peter was arguing that corpus linguistics had no value to stylistics at all, which is quite an extreme position to take. Now, to be fair to Peter, he was taking a kind of devil's advocate position and was arguing an extreme position for that reason. But nonetheless, I found it a very extreme position to take. So I was quite surprised last year when he tweeted this. So it looks like I'm a bona fide corpus stylistician now with a paper in corpora. Now, to be fair to Peter, as I said, he was taking an extreme position. And I did ask his permission to show this tweet, and he very graciously agreed. And we talked about the workshop that we'd taken part in. And he agreed that he'd been taking this position as a means of playing devil's advocate, but that it was in line with what he thought at the time, that corpus linguistics didn't have much value to stylistics. And he said that the reason he thought that was because his view was that at the time corpus linguistics was too focused on method and not focused enough on outcomes, and that while you could describe stylistic effects with corpus methods, you couldn't really account for how readers interacted with texts and inferred meaning. And interestingly enough, that's pretty much the criticism that was levelled at John Sinclair when he published that very, very famous bit of stylistic analysis in, I think, 1966, called Taking a Poem to Pieces. And he was criticised by the mainstream literary establishment for doing what they saw as a very mechanistic piece of descriptive work. And I think stylistics has moved on since then, not least because of the efforts of people like John. And Peter also admitted that corpus stylistics has moved on, corpus linguistics has moved on, and that it is better equipped to deal with stylistic effects. So Peter has seen the error of his ways and is a reformed character, he assured me. So, to turn to the value of corpus linguistics for literary studies. This is a quotation from Bettina Fisher-Stark's book on Jane Austen. I think it's a really, really interesting book. And here she's talking about the value of corpus linguistics for this kind of literary studies. And she says, new insights into the data can be gained since, one, the data is studied in a systematic and detailed way, and two, a larger number of units of meaning in language is analysed than in literary studies. Now, I would agree with point 2 there, but I would disagree, I think, with point 1. And the reason for that is that stylistics, if it's done properly, is systematic and detailed anyway. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that it's corpus linguistics that is adding the systematicity and the detail. I think what corpus linguistics does add, which I will try to show later on, is a means of increasing the replicability and the falsifiability of stylistic analyses. So I just want to have a brief look at some existing definitions of corpus stylistics. As I say, it's something that I've been working on for quite some time, and I think sometimes the term gets used without people really talking about what they mean, and I'm as guilty as that as anyone. So this quotation comes from the book that Michaela wrote with Michael Hoey and Mike Stubbs and Wolfgang Teubert. And I think, if I remember rightly, this is a section title in one of Michaela's chapters. Corpus linguistics plus brackets literary stylistics equals corpus stylistics. And there's a question mark. And I think the question mark is interesting. So I think what the suggestion there is, it is a blend of analytical practices and methods. I would say that it goes beyond the analysis purely of literary texts. I think if it's only the object of study that is causing you to use a new term, then I think that's slightly problematic. I particularly like Ron Carter's definition of corpus stylistics here. So corpus stylistic analysis is a relatively objective methodological procedure that at its best is guided by a relatively subjective process of interpretation. And I think that's a nicely nuanced way of characterising what corpus stylistics is. And Mike Stubbs has also pointed to the importance of intuition. And I think not just in corpus linguistics, but in corpus stylistics as a specific practice. So the value of corpus linguistics for stylistics then. I think, obviously, some of the things in this list, like identifying patterns in texts, that is the value of corpus linguistics for finding out about language generally. So there are some points here that will be shared with corpus linguistics generally. But I think there are some points that are particularly pertinent to the stylistic enterprise. So determining norms, for example. At the heart of stylistics is the notion of foregrounding, that the bits of a text that stand out and that you pay most attention to are those which are, in some sense, deviant, that deviate from a perceived norm. And of course, corpus techniques are a really good way of finding out what those norms are. Validating or invalidating intuitions, improving analytical standards and the reporting of results. I think that's particularly important to stylistics, and I'll try and explain why later. Increasing the potential for falsification and testing literary critical claims. Now, the last one, I think this is a role, this is a point where corpus stylistics really does have a role to play. Despite the fact that stylistics as an enterprise can be practiced on literary and non-literary texts alike, it is still the case that most stylisticians are interested in literary texts. And there is, I think, some degree of tension between stylistics and what you might see as mainstream literary criticism or non-linguistically oriented literary criticism. So I think a role for corpus stylistics is in testing some of the claims of literary critics. I'll try and give you an example, because actually I think it turns out that this is much harder to do than you might think. And the reason for that is not because of corpus methods, it's because the claims that you get in literary criticism are often non-tractable. They're quite difficult to falsify anyway. So here's a literary critic talking about Hemingway's style. Within his form, Hemingway embedded a further commentary upon language's depleted capacity for expression. For example, his paratactic syntax, which juxtaposes clauses and like syntactic units without subordinating conjunctions, creates static, abrupt sentences that seem to stammer or bark. And there's a number of claims in that little quotation that I would have problems with. The notion that language has a depleted capacity for expression, I'm not sure where that comes from. People seem to be managing okay with it so far. And this idea that the lack of subordinating conjunctions creates sentences that are static or abrupt. Well, what does that mean? And what does it mean to say that sentences stammer or bark? And really, I don't think there's much you can do with that. You know, even corpus linguistics can't help here. But that claim, at least, is something that you can look at from a linguistic perspective. So this suggestion that Hemingway doesn't use subordination very much, that he uses lots of coordination instead. And that's a claim that you find repeated in the literature. You look on Hemingway's Wikipedia site and you see that claim repeated. And it's a claim that's fairly easy to test. So I put together a corpus of 7 of Hemingway's novels and 1 short story collection. Came to about 750,000 words. I used Paul Rayson's W matrix to tag it for parts of speech, and I compared it against the BNC written imaginative sampler to try and determine whether subordinating conjunctions were indeed underrepresented as the literary critics seem to be claiming. And here's the results. So the first interesting result was that coordinating conjunctions are overrepresented in Hemingway. I thought that was interesting and might fit with the notion of subordinating conjunctions being underrepresented. But a bit further down the key part of speech list, you find subordinating conjunctions actually being overrepresented in Hemingway. So that claim from the literary critical perspective seems to have been invalidated. But I would say that's not the end of the story. That shouldn't be simply what we're trying to do, to demolish these myths. That's part of what we're trying to do. But if corpus linguistics has a value, it's to take you on to the next step. And as Andrew was saying in his plenary, it's concordance lines that are important. And once you start looking into the concordance, this is the first few concordance lines from the Hemingway corpus. And one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of that subordination is happening in direct speech. A lot is happening in first-person narration as well. So what that's pushing us towards is a new set of hypotheses to go on and test. And that, I think, is the real value of the corpus linguistic method when it's used for stylistics. It doesn't stop at the point where you disprove a literary critic. It means that you can go back to them and say, well, this is interesting. There's something more going on than we thought. And I think if I was a non-linguistically inclined literary critic, I hope that I would be receptive to this and find it interesting. Because I don't think it's enough to write mainstream literary criticism off. Literary critics are very sensitive readers of texts, and I would like to be able to go back to them and say, well, clearly you're reacting to something in Hemingway's work. It's not the subordination. So what might it be? And then to move forward and test some of those claims further. Okay, so I'm going to move on and talk about a few more different examples from work that I've done. And some of this is work that has already been published. Later on, I'll talk about some of the newer stuff. So, as I said at the beginning of the talk, my interest in corpus linguistics arose because I was working on this project looking at speech, writing and thought presentation in spoken English. And when I got my job at Huddersfield, I was given a course on the history of English to teach because nobody else wanted to do it. And I was trying to think, well, how can I make this interesting for myself? And I started to think about the work that we'd done at Lancaster looking at discourse presentation. And I thought, well, I wonder if discourse presentation has changed over time. So together with a colleague, Brian Walker, we spent some time building a corpus of early modern English, primarily fiction and news data. And we did some comparative analyses with the Lancaster corpus of speech, writing and thought presentation. And we did find some differences in how discourse presentation techniques had changed over time. And we became particularly interested in the news data that we had. Now, the problem with this is that we had a very small amount of data. The corpus that we built was about probably 60,000 words at the most. And it was so small because we were doing manual annotation, because speech, writing and thought presentation categories are functional rather than form-based. So it necessitated manual annotation, and that took a long time to do. So when we got to looking at the news section particularly, we only had just over 20,000 words that we'd annotated for these categories. So that straight away limits what you can claim on the basis of that data. And it means that what you can claim is that what you've got are a set of findings that you might use as hypotheses if you were going to look at a larger corpus. But you have to be quite careful about generalizing out from such a small amount of data. So these were the kinds of texts that we had, so ranging from the early 1500s to about towards the end of the early modern period. And we've got, towards the end of the period, newspapers as we would recognize them today. But at the beginning of the period, the newspaper didn't exist, and we've got things like letters that are reporting news events. So just to give you an overview of the findings, these are the figures for thought presentation in the news section of our corpus. And along the bottom axis there, we've got the different categories of thought presentation that we annotated for. So we've got the narrator's presentation of internal state, which is things like they felt happy, that sort of thing. The narrator's report of a thought act, he argued for a long time. Indirect thought, they considered that, blah, blah, blah. Free indirect thought, we didn't get any of that. And direct thought and free direct thought, we didn't get very much of that either. We ended up disregarding the narrator's presentation of internal state because we were trying to compare our work against the work that Eleanor Semino and Mick Short did on discourse presentation in English writing. And they came to the conclusion that that category didn't actually belong on the thought presentation scale after all. So the interesting category for us was indirect thought, because there was significantly more in the early modern corpus than there was in the present day English corpus. So our next step was to think about why that might be. This is the kind of thing that we found. So the tags are in green, and the discourse presentation categories are there in inverted commas. 'Tis reckoned that the king's journey to Holstein will not go forward till the new year, and that the Queen Dowager will then remove into her palace, which she has bought. And that was a pattern that we saw turning up again and again in our data. That is, we saw it is, or tis, and then a verb of cognition. But as I said, we have a very small amount of data. So our next step was to think, well, would we see that pattern if we looked in a larger corpus? So we used a larger corpus of 500,000 words of early modern English news that we built for another project. Now, this corpus wasn't annotated for discourse presentation categories, but having observed the pattern in the corpus that was annotated, we thought, well, now we've got a better idea of the pattern to look for in the larger corpus. So we searched for patterns based on findings from that tagged corpus, filtered those results so that we only had the sort of passive constructions that we found there. And so that was the particular search frame that we were looking for. And we did indeed find lots more examples of that kind of structure, that particular way of presenting thought. So we had things like, it is believed now, it is conjectured, it is feared that eruption may cause some obstruction, it's hoped that they lie now about Norway. And we found that that was a particular pattern in the way that thought was being presented. We also found that that grammatical pattern extended to other discourse presentation categories too. So you saw it in speech presentation, it is rumoured and it is said. And we saw that pattern across the full breadth of the larger corpus. And interestingly, the use of tis increases in the latter part of the corpus. So tis rather than it is or it's. Over half of those instances turned up in the last 2 decades. Are you seeing something of a move towards informalization in early modern news? That's one possibility. But we thought that what we were seeing there was evidence that this passive construction is a stylistic feature of early modern English news report, and that omission of the source of the original depiction of events was interesting to us, potentially for 2 reasons. First, there were restrictions on press freedom in the early modern period, so you had to be very careful about how you presented the source of your news. Secondly, a lot of news was rehashed from other sources. So again, you get early modern news writers, I think, trying to present some of these ideas kind of as their own ideas and sort of hiding the original source as a way of claiming the news for themselves. So I think there's something of that going on. The use of those verbs of cognition we thought could be related to the original content of letters, so writing verbs, and those letters then being summarized as general thought. So you've got writing presentation being turned into thought presentation. And we also thought that they might well be reflecting cognition verbs used by the original writers, particularly if they were personal letters that contained the writer's own opinions. So the point about this, to get back to the notion of corpus stylistics, is that what we're doing here is using a model of speech writing and thought presentation that was developed in stylistics. It was one that was first proposed by Jeff Leach and Mick Short in their book Style in Fiction. So we're taking a stylistic model and we're using that as the basis of an annotation scheme to try and find out something more about the style of this particular genre. Okay, so let me move on to another example now. And this one again illustrates, I think, some of the tendencies of corpus stylistics. So it's a similar project in that I was also interested in discourse presentation, but this time in a single text. And this is where I think corpus stylistics also differs from corpus linguistics. So I think sometimes the corpora that corpus stylisticians are interested in would often not be thought of as corpora in the sort of mainstream corpus linguistics sense. So the early modern corpus was very small. Here we've got a single text. Stylisticians are often interested in single text, single novels. It's not a corpus in the traditional sense, but I think you can still use corpus techniques on it. Now, I was interested in this novel because it's become quite widely talked about within stylistics as an exemplar of something called mind style. If you're not familiar with the novel, it's a novel that is narrated in the first person by a 15-year-old boy called Christopher. And Christopher has Asperger's syndrome. That's not stated specifically in the novel, but lots of literary critics have pointed to his language use as being indicative of Asperger's syndrome. And in interviews with the author, Mark Haddon, the author, has said that yes, that was his intention when he wrote the novel. So it's been widely discussed as an exemplar of mind style. So just to say a little bit about what mind style is, the concept comes from Roger Fowler's work. And he first talked about that in his book, Linguistics and the Novel. And he says that mind style arises when cumulatively consistent structural options, agreeing in cutting the presented world to one pattern or another, give rise to an impression of a worldview, what I shall call a mind style. So mind style is any distinctive linguistic presentation of an individual mental self. I'll give you an example. This is another famous example that gets talked about a lot within stylistics. This one comes from William Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury. And this narration is a first-person narration by a character called Benji, who has learning difficulties. Through the fence between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting. They were coming toward where the flag was, and I went along the fence. Luster was hunting in the grass by the flower tree. They took the flag out and they were hitting. Then they put the flag back and they went to the table, and he hit and the other hit. And what he's describing is a game of golf. But the way that he describes it gives rise to a sort of idiosyncratic view of the world, which is the result of some of the difficulties he has in processing what's going on. And you can see that reflected in particular linguistic choices. So his notion of transitivity is slightly at odds with the norm. So he talks about hitting, but he doesn't talk about hitting a ball. So that would suggest a sort of lack of sense of cause and effect in what he's observing. He's under-lexicalized, another term from Fowler. He talks about the green as being a table. And all of those linguistic choices give rise to this idiosyncratic mind style. So that's what mind style is. So to go back to the curious incident of the dog in the night time, here's a novel that has been talked about as being an exemplar of mind style. And there has been some work on this from a corpus perspective, what I would call a corpus linguistic perspective. So Eleanor Semino, for example, has compared the novel to the BNC written imaginative sampler using W matrix. And what she found was that first-person pronouns were overused in the novel compared to imaginative writing generally. And she connected that to this notion of Christopher, the narrator, being kind of focused on himself and slightly egocentric as a result of his condition. And related to that, she found that plural object pronouns were being underused. And Eleanor's work was trying to connect that to this notion of mind style. So corpus linguistics offers useful techniques for shedding light on the linguistic source of this unusual mind style. And what I was interested in doing was, again, taking that discourse presentation model and seeing whether that gave us any insight into mind style. And the way that I approached this was really to start from an intuition I had when I read the novel. So that goes back to Mike Stubbs' idea of the importance of intuition in forming hypotheses. This is an example of the sort of thing that I was picking up on intuitively. I'll just read this extract out briefly. It comes from the beginning of the novel, and Christopher's neighbour's dog has been killed in quite a gruesome manner. It's been stabbed with a garden fork, and Christopher discovers the dog dead in his neighbour's garden, and then the police turn up, and they because he's standing next to the dog, they think he's done it. The policeman looked at me for a while without speaking. Then he said, "I'm arresting you for assaulting a police officer." This made me feel a lot calmer, because it's what policemen say on television and in films. Then he said, I strongly advise you to get into the back of the police car, because if you try any of that monkey business again, you little shit, I will seriously lose my rag. Is that understood? I walked over to the police car, which was parked just outside the gate. He opened the back door and I got inside. He climbed into the driver's seat and made a call on his radio to the policewoman, who was still inside the house. He said, the little bugger just had a pop at me, Kate. Can you hang on with Mrs. S while I drop him off at the station? I'll get Tony to swing by and pick you up. And she said, sure, I'll catch you later. The policeman said, okie doke, and we drove off. And the bit that stood out to me intuitively when I was reading the novel was the direct speech, because it seemed to me that there was a lot of direct speech in this novel, and that some of those strings of direct speech were very long. And that gave rise to a couple of hypotheses. Is there more direct speech in this novel than in novels generally? And are the strings of direct speech longer than you would find in novels generally? So what I observed was what I thought was some kind of foregrounding. Here's what Jeff Leach has to say about foregrounding, that formally foregrounding is a deviation or departure from what is expected in the linguistic code or the social code expressed through language. Functionally, it's a special effect or significance conveyed by that departure. So what we're saying is not foregrounding at the formal level, but foregrounding at the functional level, and that is kind of harder to deal with. So it did make me think, well, am I really seeing more direct speech in this novel than you would see in novels generally? So to test it, I annotated the novel in the same way that we'd annotated the early modern corpus. So it took about a week of not doing very much else, and I've spent happier weeks. And that's the kind of annotation that I was using. So again, the categories of speech presentation in inverted commas there, which then meant that I was able to extract the various different categories and quantify them and count the words and so on and so forth. Now, before I get onto the next slide, what I did first of all was to compare the novel against the Lancaster corpus of speech, writing and thought presentation, the written corpus. And I compared it just against the fiction section of that corpus. And I found that, yes, indeed, there was more direct speech in The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time when compared against direct speech in fiction generally. So that was a nice finding after a week's work. But then I thought, well, that contains third-person and first-person narration, and that's the problem with the BNC sampler, of course. So then I just looked at the first-person section of the corpus. There's about 63,000 words in the novel as a whole. 9,757 words of those are direct speech. In the first-person section of the Lancaster corpus, there's 33,000 words and 6,591 words of direct speech. And there's no significant difference there. So direct speech is not turning up more in the novel than it is in first-person narration generally. So that's kind of disappointing. But it's an interesting finding. Then I looked at the length of the direct speech strings. And when you do the sum, what you find is a mean string length of 11.1 words for the novel, 9.7 words for first-person narration generally. And again, that's not a big difference. And if you look at the direct speech string length on a graph, here's the graph for The Curious Incident, and here's the graph for the first-person narration generally, and you're not seeing large amounts of variation there. Okay. So we've got a sort of negative result, but negative results are interesting. So direct speech is not overrepresented in the novel compared to the first-person narration generally. There is just one caveat to this, and that is that when I looked in the first-person section of the Lancaster corpus, I think there is a novel in there that does have particularly long strings of direct speech, and it does make me wonder whether that is skewing the results somewhat. But nonetheless, based on the results that I got, direct speech is not overrepresented in the novel. The direct speech strings are not significantly longer in the novel than in first-person narration generally. And I think what that points towards is saying, well, direct speech usage can't be linked to the concept of an abnormal mind style. But this is useful because it means we've been able to put that to one side and say, well, if we're observing mind style in the novel, then this is not the cause of it. Does it mean that direct speech is not foregrounded? I would argue no. It's not foregrounded quantitatively, but in particular contexts within the novel, it may well be foregrounded. If you've got lots and lots of instances of short strings of direct speech and you suddenly get a long one, it's going to break that little pattern that has been set up. And just going back to the original example that I used, when I went back to that and started to think, well, you know, what is going on with the direct speech? It struck me that one of the things that's happening is that you're getting enormous amounts of detail in that direct speech. Speech reported that from a narrator who is perhaps less abnormal in mind style terms might be put into indirect speech or into minimal speech presentation or something like that. And then when you look at the other categories of speech presentation that this narrator uses, what you find is he has a very limited set of techniques. So it's direct speech or indirect speech with a little bit of narrator's presentation of a thought, of a speech act. You don't get any free indirect speech. You don't get any very minimal speech presentation categories. So I think that is probably the more interesting finding, that here you've got a narrator who has a limited set of options from which he chooses. So that again is, I think, Corpus Stylistics. It's using a model of speech and thought presentation developed in stylistics, and this time it's going a bit further because it's using another stylistic concept to try and make sense of the results of the corpus analysis. So we've got the model of speech and thought presentation being used in conjunction with this notion of mind style. Okay, so for the last part of my talk, what I want to talk about is some newer work that I've been doing. And I think over the years, as people have got more interested in corpus techniques, in stylistics, I think that what we've started to see is some washback effects from corpus linguistics in the way that people do stylistics. Now, the first point is anecdotal. I took over as editor of Language and Literature in January, and I've been involved with the journal for about 6 or 7 years now. And I do think that one of the things that I've seen over those years is people becoming more careful about data selection. So rather than just submitting an article that presents an analysis of a text that is interesting, nowadays I think people are thinking more carefully about why they've selected that data. So, you know, you will get things like, here's an analysis of an opening of a novel, and I chose the opening of a novel because I'm interested in characterization, and I expect that there will be more going on at the beginning of the story to sort of help the reader get a sense of characters, and that's why I've chosen the beginning and not the middle, and so on and so forth. So I do think people are taking selection of texts for qualitative analysis a bit more seriously in stylistics, which I think is a good thing. The second point where I think we're seeing a development is in the use of annotation in stylistics. Not just in large-scale corpus projects, but in qualitative projects as well. Now, it's hard to connect that explicitly to corpus linguistics, but I do think if you look at, you know, the increase in articles that refer to corpora and corpus linguistics and corpus stylistics that appear in Language and Literature, I think that, you know, there may well be something going on there. It may well be an influence. So one of the things that I think is really useful, and this goes back to the beginning of my talk, is the use of manual annotation for the analysis of stylistic effects and stylistic functions. And it limits what you're able to do in terms of the amount of text that you can look at, but nonetheless, I still think it's a useful way of doing stylistics. So what I want to talk about is some work that I've been doing with colleagues at Huddersfield and Queen's University on text world theory. Now, As corpus stylistics has moved forwards, I think one of the really valuable things that it's tried to do is to bring cognitive approaches to stylistics and corpus approaches together. And Michaela, I think, has been at the forefront of that work in her work with Peter Stockwell on looking at characterization and how cognitive approaches to characterization can be combined with corpus methods. And so we were interested in trying to also bring cognitive and corpus approaches together, and we look particularly at text world theory. And text world theory has been particularly influential in stylistics. It's really a cognitive model of the reading process. So how do you make sense of a text as you read? How do you build a conceptualization of the fictional world, if indeed it's fiction that you're reading? It originates in the work of Paul Worth, and it was later developed by Joanna Gavins. And what it posits is that all discourse situations can be characterized as involving 3 levels of conceptual activity. So you start in the discourse world, which is essentially the real world, the world in which you sit down and you read something. And as you read, what you start to do in response to various cues in the text is build a text world, a sort of mental representation of what's going on in that text. And you won't just build one text world, you'll build numerous text worlds. So if you get a flashback, you will get what text world theorists call a world switch to another text world. Or if you get a character hypothesizing about something, you'll get a world switch to a modal world. And you build up this sort of complex network of worlds. Okay? So text world theory basically is a model of that reading process. And where I think text world theory can be really useful is in helping stylisticians to observe patterns in texts. I'll try and illustrate this. Here's an example of a very straightforward bit of text world building. This is from the beginning of Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. One evening of late summer before the 19th century had reached 1/3 of its span, a young man and woman, the latter carrying a child, were approaching the large village of Weydon Priors in Upper Wessex on foot. They were plainly but not ill-clad, though the thick hoar of dust which had accumulated on their shoes and garments from an obviously long journey lent a disadvantageous shabbiness to their appearance just now. So if you start to read that novel, the first thing that you will do is start to build a concept in your head of what's going on in this fictional world. Text world theory says you do that in response to various cues. So those are world-building elements and function-advancing propositions. So the world-building elements are time, location, enactors, which you can think of as characters, and objects. So we've got references to time, one evening of late summer before the 19th century had reached 1/3 of its span. We've got references to location, the large village of Weydon Priors, enactors, a young man and a woman, objects, their shoes and garments, and so on. And obviously, the more specified detail that you get, the richer your text world becomes. We've then got function-advancing propositions, we've got material processes we're approaching, we've got existential processes, we're plainly but not ill-clad, and so on and so forth. And we've also got a world switch to a past text world in which the dust actually accumulates on their shoes. When we meet them at the beginning of the novel, the dust is already there. Okay? So text world theory makes much of trying to diagram the process of reading. The problem, of course, is a problem that you get with a lot of stylistic analyses, and that is that you can't analyse large quantities of text in this amount of detail with this particular model. And it's a problem that Jeff Leach and Mick Short point out in their book Style in Fiction, when they say that the bulk of prose writing is intimidating. And what we were interested in trying to do was to see if there's a way of making it possible to do text world theory on longer stretches of text. So to do this, we worked with colleagues in the School of Computing at Huddersfield to develop some software which we call Worldbuilder, which is basically an annotation tool. an annotation tool and a visualization tool for doing text world analysis. So I'll try and show that to you now. Okay, so here's the Worldbuilder site, and on the left-hand menu, you can find out a bit more about text world theory. You can find out about the annotation scheme that we used, and there's a user guide to the software as well. Now, the first thing that you would do if you're going to use the system is input a text, upload a text to Worldbuilder. You have to part of speech tag the text first of all. Now, there isn't a part of speech tagger built into the system at the moment, so we've been using the clause tagger at Lancaster, and we hope that we'll be able to build that into the system at a later point. So you upload your part of speech tagged file, and it appears in the middle window there. This is the beginning of a novel by Louis de Bernier. I think it's Captain Corelli's Mandolin. On the right-hand menu there, you can click the check boxes to view the part of speech tags, and they appear over the words, like so. Just below that, we've got a box saying View Annotation Marks for Text World Theory. Now, obviously, you can't do that yet because you haven't put any annotation marks in. So, to try and explain how this works, what you would do first of all is click on the World Nodes tab. And the first thing that you would do is add information about the discourse world. So that's the real world context in which you're reading. So a dialog box pops up, you choose world type is discourse world, and you might make a note of the reading situation. Dan reading in his office, something like that. Click on the tick, and that records that in the menu on the right-hand side there. Once you've done that, then you can start adding information about text worlds in the text. So the first thing you would do is identify what you think is the main text world. So let's say we think that's what's going on there. The dialog box pops up again, and this time in world type, we can choose text world. And we can specify whether it's an actualized physical text world or whether it's a sort of mental world that is going on in a character's or narrator's head, something like that. So you identify the text world generally. That appears in that right-hand menu. And once you've started to do that, then you can start adding in information about world-building elements and function-advancing propositions. So click on Dr. Yanis, go to world-building elements. That's a person and then actor in text world terms. So we can mark that, and that appears as one of the world-building elements on the right-hand menu. Similarly, we can mark up the verb phrases as function-advancing propositions, so a material process, past tense, click, and so forth. Okay, so you go through your text in that way, marking up your text for categories derived from text world theory. And once you've done that, what you get is a fully marked up file. And so the window that I'm showing you there has underlinings and different colors and shading and so forth, which indicates the various different text world theory categories that we've used. Once you've done that, you can click on a tab to see some basic stats about the file that you've marked up. So we've got word length, average sentence length, that sort of thing. You can see the number of different text worlds in your text, the number of different world switches, the number of different processes. You can look at the number of processes in each particular text world. And you can also use the visualization function. So the visualization function doesn't produce the kind of diagrams that you get in text world theory, but I think it works as a shorthand way of keeping those decisions recorded. You can click on each text world and you can see the world building elements and the function advancing propositions. The arrows indicate world switches between worlds. The green circles are actualized physical text worlds. The blue circles are mental worlds. And having done that, over the course of a long quantity of text, you can start to see patterns in the data. So, just to finish off, what I want to just talk through very briefly is an analysis that we did of 3 statements from the Amanda Knox murder trial. So, from the case, the Meredith Kercher case. Now, if you're not familiar with this, in November 2007, Meredith Kercher, who was a British student, was found dead in her apartment in Perugia, in Italy. In 2008, Rudy Guede was convicted of her murder and sexual assault. Kercher's housemate was Amanda Knox, an American student, and her Italian boyfriend, Raffaele Sollecito, they were also convicted of the murder of Kercher. Their convictions were later quashed in 2011, but that acquittal was then overturned at a retrial in 2014. And in 2015, eventually, the Court of Cassation in Italy annulled those convictions and they were set free. So as a means of testing the software and whether it would give us the capacity to see patterns over longer stretches of text, what we annotated were 3 statements that Knox had given to police. So here are the statements. We worked with the translation. So the first 2 were translated from Italian. The third statement was written in English. So there is obviously an issue there, and we're currently working on doing a similar analysis of the original Italian statements. The first statement was made at 1:45 in the morning, the next one at 5:45 in the morning, and statement 3 was unsolicited by the police, and it was handwritten by Amanda Knox. If you read through the statements, you can see some obvious differences in how events are reported. So in statement 1, she says, I met Patrick soon after at the basketball court of Piazza Grimana and we went home. Patrick was the owner of a bar where Amanda Knox worked. In statement 2, you get a bit more detail. We met soon after at about 9 o'clock at the basketball court of Piazza Grimana. We went to my apartment in Via della Pergola, number 7. And in the handwritten statement, you get a much longer description of what happened. I told Raffaele that I didn't have to work and that I could remain at home for the evening. After that, I believe we relaxed in his room together. Perhaps I checked my email, perhaps I read or studied, or perhaps I made love to Raffaele. In fact, I think I did make love with him. You'd think you'd remember that. However, I admit this period of time is rather strange because I'm not quite sure. I smoked marijuana with him and I might even have fallen asleep. I stand by my statements that I made last night about events that could have taken place in my home with Patrick. So what we did was to annotate the statements using Worldbuilder, and then to use the visualization tool to look at the differences in the patterning of the text worlds. And if you look at statement 1, what you can see is that it's very straightforward. You've got 4 actualized physical text worlds, and then you've got a modal world as an offshoot of one of those text worlds. Statement 2 is a little bit more complex. We've got an additional text world, actualized text world, and we've got 2 modal worlds. When you look at the handwritten statement, it's quite a lot more complex. So you've got a whole lot more modal worlds switching away from those main text worlds. So what does all this tell you? Well, here are some observations from the visualizations of the statements. So in statements 1 and 2, Amanda Knox is being projected as an actor responsible for the reported actions and events that implicate her in the crime. So things like, I replied to the message, I met Patrick, we went home, so on and so forth. But in statement 3, she's projected as a censor, presenting much more prominent epistemic uncertainty. Things like, I do not remember, I think. Okay. In statement 1, you get 3 spatio-temporal world switches. 2 of those are flashbacks to Amanda Knox being at home, and you get 1 epistemic world switch to an epistemic modal world, which is indicative of uncertainty. In statement 2, you get 4 spatio-temporal world switches, and you get 2 epistemic world switches, again, indicative of uncertainty. In statement 3, the number of epistemic world switches goes up quite a lot. You get 8. And interestingly, events that are reported affirmatively in statements 1 and 2 are suddenly placed within a modal world in statement 3. So you get a high degree of epistemic uncertainty. And the consequence for that is that the truth value of the propositions being expressed become inaccessible in text world theory terms. So just on that issue of accessibility and inaccessibility, what a witness has seen is accessible through questioning. What a witness has heard from someone else is inaccessible by other co-participants. And as Worth and Gavin's point out, its truthfulness therefore remains unverified in the discourse world, in the real world. And that principle of accessibility or inaccessibility might well be important, and you might well apply it in assessing whether a given proposition could be admissible as evidence to a court of law. So that's just an indication of the kind of thing that we were doing with the Worldbuilder system, looking at the style of these statements and trying to do text world theory on longer stretches of text using manual annotation in order to try and see patterns that you wouldn't see if you were just looking at small quantities of text. So I think it gives you a number of advantages. It increases the analytical scope of text world theory because it increases the potential for the analysis of longer texts and more data. The visualization tools offer you the potential to see patterns in the data that you might not otherwise see. I think it has the potential to improve systematicity too. And the availability of your annotated data also opens this analysis up to replication and falsifiability, because it means you can pass your annotated data set on to someone else and they can argue with you, they can take issue with it. And I think that's what you don't see quite so much in stylistics. And that is in line with a move towards open data generally in the sciences and social sciences, which I think is a good thing. So I think I'm nearly out of time, so just to move to some conclusions. Going back to this question of what corpus stylistics is, I would say that it's best used to describe a particular focus of corpus linguistics, one in which the research questions that you're investigating and or the analytical frameworks that you're using are primarily concerned with issues of style. So not solely focused on the analysis of literature, but focused on the analysis of style in texts. I think it's important to note that corpus stylistics might well deviate from conventional definitions of what a corpus is. So some corpus stylistic work, like Michaela's Click project, for example, is working with a large corpus. Other corpus stylisticians are working with single texts. Others are working with small corpora. And I think there are degrees of corpus stylistics as well. So using corpus linguistic tools and analytical techniques to test a literary critical claim is one thing. I think you're doing a bit more stylistic-y corpus work if you're using, say, a stylistic model to inform an annotation scheme, or a stylistic concept to help you interpret results. So I think what you see in corpus stylistics is various types of work: corpus-based work, corpus-informed or corpus-assisted work, or even work like the text world theory stuff, which I think is corpus-inspired rather than sort of central to corpus linguistics. So what corpus linguistics offers to stylistics is a set of methods and theories for exploring large quantities of text, and that's what you need to do quite often if you want to see where stylistic features are located and where they're coming from. What I think stylistics might have to offer to corpus linguistics is a set of theories and models and analytical frameworks that might be of value in interpreting corpus data or the results of corpus analysis. Foregrounding theory, perhaps, might be useful in reducing keyword lists. So, given the topic of the first two plenary talks at this conference, and given the fact that I was going last, I felt almost duty-bound to include an extinct animal reference. So here it is. I think that while corpus linguistic methods are not the solution to all stylistic questions, stylisticians who are wholly uninterested in corpus linguistics will soon find themselves going the way of the dodo. That's it. Thank you very much.